Good afternoon, everyone.
Quite an intro there, Jack.
That is quite an intro. Jack asked us a number of questions, all of which were completely embarrassing. So we were not entirely sure what that intro was going to be or what he was going to say. So you took it easy on us, Jack. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. All right, well, thank you guys for being here. We're going to jump in because we have a lot to say, but we also know a lot of you have questions. A lot of you stopped us and started talking about this topic already, and so we want to make sure that we have ample time to jump in. So Anna, any opening comments from you before we get started?
Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. Now we're going. What did you ask me? Anything else?
Any opening comments before we jump in?
I think that over the past 2 years, we've talked about delivery ad nauseum for people. It's probably the main topic we've been talking to restaurateurs about. It's definitely something that's a big concern. We've had multiple meetings with restaurateurs and some of the delivery companies about it, some of which are on the show floor. Are there any delivery companies in the audience?
Oh, great.
Where are y'all from? Oh, great.
Amazon.
We're going to talk about you, and we're going to talk a little bit about that guy back there from Waiter.
Good.
Very cool.
Awesome.
So let's jump in.
All right, sounds good. All right, so on-demand delivery and restaurants. So as Anna said, we've been doing a lot of work. Anna previously worked at the National Restaurant Association, leading a lot of our marketing and innovation work. And as we started this conversation, and Anna, jump in here, we really discovered that there was a need for a collaborative effort. How do you bring restaurants and delivery companies together? What are best practices? What is the customer expecting? And that's been a lot of the conversation we've been having is who's liable? Once the food leaves the restaurant, whose responsibility is it? What are the expectations around food delivery? And then, of course, as Anna can attest to, delivery is driving sales, and it's driving the restaurant dollar. And so we've heard a lot of feedback, to Anna's point, over the last 2 years about why delivery is so important, and quite frankly, why this area continues to grow in the restaurant space.
Yeah, definitely. Just some statistics to give you guys an idea of how big this is. I think last year the NRA put out a statistic that said 75% of restaurant meals are consumed off-premise. 75%. So that means drive-through, takeout, to go, things like that. So curbside pickup. So full 75% of what your sales are right now are going out the door. And the biggest thing is consumers are staying home more. They want the opportunity to get a restaurant quality meal at home. That's why you see the rise of meal kit services, things like that. They want better quality food, and they want to get it from restaurants too. So that's driving a lot of this big trend as well. There is this number astounded me, but Morgan Stanley predicted that the U.S. food delivery market could grow from $11 billion that it is today to as much as $210 billion at some point in the future. So this is not going away. We definitely need to work out how best to work with delivery companies as restaurateurs. And I'm sure Amazon would love to know that as well.
So there's your. I'm behind you.
Yeah,
I'll catch up. I promise. There you go.
So here's who we consider some of the major players. Sorry, waiter. These guys have been in the business for a long time. Obviously, you recognize Grubhub, Yelp, whenever they acquired Eat24. Favor is actually only based in Texas, and so that's why I kept them up here. They were actually larger. They had expanded into multiple states, but then pulled back their efforts after they decided they wanted to control it and be Texas-based. Postmates, DoorDash, Delivery.com, Amazon, of course, is up there, Dashed, and Caviar, which is wholly owned by Square, the payments company. So there's a lot of people in this space. There's actually more than this, some regional ones, but these are considered some of the major players.
Yeah, and in considering some of the regional players, we met Julius this afternoon, who's in the back, and we'll give all you guys a chance to speak from the delivery point of view in just a second, but who's operating in the Southeast, 5 states, right, Julius? And seeking to expand. So a lot of the conversation we're going to have here today, well, it's about delivery companies. How many of you do delivery from your restaurants? Maybe it's not third-party delivery, but it's by your employees. Okay, so there's a little bit of a mix then. Some of you will use an Amazon or a Waiter or another app, and then some of you just do it directly. And are those your employees when you do it directly? You hire those folks? You both? Okay, you do both. Okay, all right, good to know.
And then, so how many of you work with third-party delivery companies? Okay. How do you like those fees? We're going to talk about that.
Great question.
So obviously there's some issues with some of the third-party delivery companies. I think it all stems from one of the biggest issue is delivery without permission, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But there have been multiple lawsuits in this area. DoorDash, which I know is an exhibitor on the floor, has been sued, I think, 3 times at this point. All have settled out of court. They were sued by In-N-Out and a couple other big brands for just that, intellectual property abuse, because when someone is delivering your food without permission, they have to scrape your menu information to be able to do that. So the way these guys go to market whenever they go to a new town is they actually look up what are some of the most popular restaurants that are searched in this town, say in Dallas, if they were coming to Dallas. And so they say, oh, well, they're looking at some of the Google search feeds, Google search history, and they're able to say, okay, this is the biggest burger restaurant, biggest pizza, biggest sandwich restaurant. We want their information. So then they go out and take your logo and they take your menu information and your menu pricing and your menu descriptions and they put it on their app. And they start delivering the food. And then the way they follow up is 6 months later, they say, hey, restaurateur, did you know that we were delivering your food without your permission? This is how it works, and you should work with us. So that's not exactly the best approach, especially in the restaurant business, which we consider to be, very hospitable and friendly and just talk to us, not a big deal. And for some of these restaurateurs who have sued DoorDash specifically, it's because of that. Is that intellectual property abuse? Unfortunately, because they've all settled out of court, we don't have a court case that we can point to and say, yes, that is exactly what it is. And we don't know for how much either, unfortunately.
Yeah, and some of the snags and issues, quite frankly, everybody always says, why is the government person talking about this issue? Why do we have somebody from DC talking about it? Because the snags and the issues are getting to be pretty palpable. So when the phone calls start coming to Anna and I, and it's, what are you doing about this? What are you doing about this? What are you doing about this? Then certainly we've had restaurateurs talk to me about introducing legislation to stop some of those abuses, to correct some of the snags and issues. But then Anna and I got together and said, hang on, have we actually facilitated a conversation about this topic? Everything shouldn't go to legislation, or everything doesn't need to go to the government immediately. Let's just take a time out here and pause. And so to Anna's point, we've been talking to a lot of restaurateurs. We've also been tracking a lot of these cases because there's not a lot of conversation. This is not case law. There's not government regulating out here. This is still a space where there's a lot of innovation, and it truly is a relationship, restaurant to delivery company or peer-to-peer in terms of restaurant to restaurant. And so as Anna and I dug into a lot of these categories, getting into staffings and fees and some of the operational pieces, then we found quite a bit of commonality, actually. We found quite a bit of conversation between the restaurant owner and between the actual, whether it's an app or a delivery company. It was like, hang on, we all want what's best for the customer. So as opposed to a restaurateur calling me and saying, you need to introduce legislation to stop this immediately, the timeout was actually probably came at the right time, because we did want to work through a lot of these pieces, but also seek feedback. So you guys who are here in the room, and some of you said you do it yourselves versus those of you who have companies who do it, you guys know better than we do. So while we're facilitating a conversation on behalf of our members, we sought your input as well, and sought the input of folks who do their own delivery, but also people who have your own delivery companies and apps, because there's got to be a moment where we all try to come together and find that middle ground. And that's the purpose, quite frankly, of today's conversation. And so part of that conversation with restaurateurs is this good disruption for your business, for our industry? Is it bad? Let's just start with, what is the perception of this relationship? Are you guys going into it thinking, I got to do it because I have to do it because everybody else is doing it, because this is what my consumer expects? Or was it, hey, this is a good opportunity for partnership. This can drive sales. To Anna's point, consumers want that restaurant experience at home. So just level set, what was the expectation going into some of these conversations and relationship, and what was expected? So were you on the same page from the get-go, or was it completely sort of a disconnect from the start that's only gotten worse as the relationship has gone on? And so we talked about disruption, good disruption, bad disruption, and as we pulled a lot of this information together, we brought both sides together. So you talk about collaboration, and what does that mean? We came to Chicago, and we met with the folks who were all who were on the screen, and brought together several restaurateurs, because we had started getting calls from Illinois. We had gotten calls from California, and it was starting to spread in various pockets around the country. And so we spent all day at a meeting in Chicago, and just brought everybody together and said, okay, now's a good time for that timeout we talked about. Now is a good time to assess what were your expectations going in, were those expectations met? If they were not met, why not? What is the disconnect, and then how do we get it all back on track? Because at the end of the day, again, the one point of conversation that everybody agrees with is the consumer. We want to give them what they want. We want our consumers to be happy. So if we're all on the same page, how does that happen? Anything to add there before we move on?
So just a couple other snags too that I wanted to mention that is not gone unnoticed by us. We've heard from some restaurateurs that they're unable to, all my notes are on here, so, that they're not able to handle it with all this current staff that they have. So sometimes during busy lunch rushes or dinner rushes, they don't have enough staff to handle all the delivery orders that are coming in. Or maybe deliveries handled by a bartender, and they need to make drinks for lunch and dinner. They don't have time to package up all the delivery products. So it's a staffing issue, and it's hard to anticipate, when those rushes are going to come until the historical data is shared, Uber, about what sort of patterns people can look for. The good thing is you can also turn off delivery. If you're working with those companies, you can turn off delivery during certain rushes if you can't handle it. But then, of course, you're missing out on the money that would be a part of that. We've seen some restaurants actually set up second lines, second serving lines. We've seen this for online orders, but also for delivery companies, where they set up separate lines in the back just for preparation of delivery food, which is pretty amazing. If you have the space available, obviously that's wonderful. But not a lot of people are able to do that. And then I want to talk a little bit about food integrity, because that was one of the things we discussed during the Guidelines Summit. Do I have a thing on it? I don't think I do. And I'll give an anecdote about something I heard about recently. There's a pizzeria out of Minneapolis. This pizzeria, I'm not going to name their name, but they are very well known, and they're very well known because they're able to provide very specific meals for people who have food allergies. Mm-hmm. So they have gluten-free crusts, and they can do things without dairy, and they're very observant of soy allergies and things like that. So someone went on a delivery app. I also won't name their name. And unfortunately, because this restaurant and this delivery company weren't working together, the delivery company had sort of half-assed put their menu up online. And so as you're going through and ordering, whenever you do it through the pizzeria, which of course has their own delivery platform, when you do it through the pizzeria, you go through a series of questions. Okay, you want a pepperoni pizza. Do you want cheese on it? Okay, I have a dairy allergy. What kind of cheese can you have? Can you have dairy-free, or do you want, the soy-based cheese or something like that? Okay, you have a gluten allergy. Yes. Do you want a gluten-free crust? Like, it goes through that whole process that you would normally do inside a POS. Unfortunately, this delivery company hadn't pulled all that information over. And so even though this customer was ordering a pizza, got the gluten-free, didn't get the dairy-free cheese. Unfortunately, this person ate the pizza thinking that it was completely fine and ended up in the hospital. Who's at fault? I mean, I would say the delivery company is, because the opportunity was given for the consumer, or the opportunity was not given for the consumer to say, I need to have dairy-free cheese on my pizza. Luckily, the person survived, but it could have turned out a lot worse. We can't just sit there, though, and say delivery companies are to blame for this. This is not fair. I do think that the onus also has to be on restaurateurs to work with them. And I will happily advise you on how to do that and how to get the best out of that kind of relationship. But this is happening in your space, and to continue to ignore it is to continue to put your consumers at risk, whether they are going to order from you or order from the delivery company. So I absolutely encourage you to work with them so that your menu is updated correctly in the app. And I'll happily talk to you guys later about how to do that.
Yeah, and so that came up as actually part of our very first sort of best practice we identified at this meeting that day. And Anna's right. One of the things we heard more often than not from all restaurateurs around the country was, they're just taking my menu and putting it on their site. I didn't say yes to this. I didn't agree to this. How do I stop them? What do I do? And they were seeking our advice, but also, as you can imagine, venting a little bit about, aren't they supposed to come talk to me? Isn't there? And so we got into the topic of contracts. And actually, I was talking to Julius about this earlier. How does he do it? And how restaurateurs come to him and sign up and voluntarily do all the disclosures. And he and I were having this conversation before we got started. But if nothing else, we all agreed you have to have a contract to form the basis of this relationship. And while that sounds pretty obvious, you may shake your head and go, yeah, why is that best practice? Believe it or not, more often than not, most of the conversations we had, this was the biggest frustration that people voiced. It was that there wasn't a contract. If there was, well, I mean, did it cover the liability that Anna's talking about? Did it go through all the pieces that were necessary? And so sort of just starting with, okay, if there's not a basic piece of paper governing the two of you and who's doing what and what's actually spelled out in the contract, that's probably a good place to start, right? So let's just be very foundational here and very fundamental in terms of start there. Start with, if you know someone has your menu on their app, as Anna advised them, guys, call them. Call them up. Ask them, hey, who'd you talk to in my restaurant? Have you talked to my manager? Did you talk to me? What was that conversation like? Because I see that you have my menu on your app or your website, and I want to sort of figure out, I don't recall you talking to me, so how did it get there? The contract piece, to Anna's point, very quickly led to intellectual property. Who owns it? Who manages it? And as you all well know, getting into intellectual property rules, you're getting to a much deeper sort of scale and scope in terms of now you're beyond the relationship. It's still a piece of it, but now you're truly digging into the ownership, the liability, pieces that often come with that. Who's liable, who's not liable. And I often tell people the government is not regulating in this space. So we didn't quickly seek legislation saying, hey, all delivery companies are bad, and we didn't seek legislation saying, hey, all restaurants are doing this right. What we said was, the government's not in this space. You probably don't want the government in this space. So let's just take that off the table right now and make that maybe, point of last resort, not the first place to go. And as you talk about intellectual property, as you talk about technology, you talk about the role of technology in restaurants, and I know Anna's done a lot of work in the role of technology in restaurants, you very quickly get to an intellectual property conversation, whether it's about delivery or not. And so that comes up obviously in a number of forms, whether that's through innovation or automation, or whether it is truly through the app itself. To Anna's point, we heard a lot about food safety. Similar to her story, we had a story of a gentleman that day who was very fired up that he has a fine dining restaurant, and the story that he recounted to us was that food was sitting at the counter, was ready to go out the door, and the manager walked by because someone picking it up dumped the dish over in the bag, and the manager said, hang on a second, whoa, 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 where are you going with that?
I think it was a Mexican food restaurant.
And exactly. And he said, well, I'm delivering it. He goes, you're not delivering it like that. He said, my customer expects that food to get there in the exact way I just had it before you dumped it in your bag. And they got into quite an altercation, as you can imagine, in a conversation about why that food, like that's not proper delivery, it's not proper presentation. But okay, now let's get into food safety. What food safety practices has folks been trained on? What is the protocol once it leaves the restaurant? To Anna's point earlier, you start to get into maybe some allergies and some gluten-free, some different tolerance levels in terms of food. There's just a lot that goes into this conversation beyond just, hi, it's going from point A to point B, and then everybody's happy. You have to sort of go down a couple of levels deeper because the food safety piece, and granted, we talked to many of the folks in the room who were there that day, have food safety practices, they have training, they have protocols. This was not, but we have some folks who are bad actors in this space, and we have to acknowledge that there needs to be some guidelines and some parameters set around what are the food safety expectations. And while that story is just simply anecdotal feedback, to say the least, it sparked quite a conversation about what is that expectation, who is liable, and then what is the food quality? What is the safety once it leaves the restaurant? So we spent quite a bit of time on that. Obviously, bad actors and consumers we've already talked about being the other two pieces. But we said if we do nothing else in this conversation, if we just boil it down to 5 things, where do you start? These are probably the 5 things you start with. These are the fundamental things you have to have in place, whether you're doing it through an app or you folks said you were doing it yourself, so I'll be curious to get your feedback when we get through this. But there's all kinds of different ways to go about this conversation, but if you just boil it down, these are some of the simple pieces we have to start with in terms of making sure everyone's on the same page, and again, we're all serving the best, the consumer, which is the best interest of the consumer.
One of the things too is especially when you think about food integrity, I mean, obviously a plate of enchiladas, if you slosh that over in a bag, that's really not appealing at all. But if you take those steps, it could deliver just fine. It could get where it needs to go.
Sure.
One thing, though, that we've really run into that I would really challenge any delivery companies in the audience to think about is all of our restaurant operators and their employees are trained in food handling. And we're seeing some really poor food handling practices, especially when it comes to hygiene from some of their runners. People show up, looking kind of schlubby. Obviously, these people aren't employees. These are contractors, so you can't mandate a uniform, which is an issue. So they're not mandating a uniform, and so they're able to wear whatever they want to wear. This shows up off the street, that's fine. And then they put it in their car, maybe in an insulated bag if you're lucky, but then it goes in a car, which might have been cleaned recently. Who knows? I mean, if this is a college student delivering this, I mean, my brother's in college. Like, I know what his car looks like. It's so gross. I wouldn't want him putting food in a car and delivering it to a person. And so those basic good practices, those are covered in things like Serve Safe food handling courses. I would really love to see some delivery companies. The first delivery company that comes out and says all of our runners have to have this food service or food handling certificate, that would be amazing. I would promote them for years, because that would just be fantastic. And what a good step and good faith effort to show to your restaurant partners.
Yeah. Anything else before we move on? All right, because I want to give these guys a chance to jump in. So, all right, let's take a break from just on demand, and we'll come back to it, because as this conversation has started, to Anna's point, there's a lot here, and I want to open it up. But the virtual restaurant has come up in a number of conversations that we've had, both as part of this summit, but also as we've been doing some of these presentations about just what is best practice. Virtual restaurants, anybody here doing a virtual restaurant? Anybody here thinking, okay. Anybody here thinking of doing a virtual restaurant? Okay. We've got several folks we've talked to who are definitely trying it now, and I even talked to a gentleman last week who had some best practices in New Orleans, who was trying to launch one in New Orleans. But Anna, I'll turn it over to you, because government is not doing anything with virtual restaurants, so I'm happy for them to stay out of this.
Yeah, y'all, government can stay out of a lot of things. Thanks. So virtual restaurants, y'all all know what we mean when we say virtual restaurant. Sometimes they're called ghost restaurants, but I really don't like that terminology. A virtual restaurant is a restaurant that does not have a storefront, does not have seating. It doesn't actually exist if you're just walking on the street. It exists only in the cloud on a third-party or delivery-only platform. So if you think about it, it's like, okay, say you have some sort of really nice seafood restaurant and you have a few items on your menu that are fried. Well, you could easily peel off those menu items that deliver well, maybe some deep fried items if they're ventilated, or something else that's smaller. And you could say, okay, we've got this fine dine like Joe's, it's a lettuce brand, but Joe's, and they have all this great seafood, but then they want to spin it off and say like, Joe's Shrimp Shack or something like that is delivery only, virtual. They create branding around it, they create marketing around it, they create packaging around it, and it's delivery only. You would never have any idea as a consumer that this restaurant doesn't exist in real life. For example, there's this company in New York called Green Summit Group, and they have purchased excellent Manhattan real estate in basements of buildings because it's way cheaper and it's centrally located. They don't need a nice glass storefront, and they're operating, I think, at least 6 different concepts out of that basement restaurant. Because all they have to do is rebrand anytime that they want to put a new restaurant out in there. So they put it on Grubhub or something like that. And so all of a sudden, this new restaurant pops up. It's really kind of amazing, actually, because think about the overhead. You have people preparing the food, taking the orders, either online or sometimes fax. And then that's really it. You don't actually pay any of the drivers because you do it all through third party. You don't have any servers. You don't have any hosts. You have managers to keep all the wheels turning, but that's really it. So we're seeing some really cool stuff happen in this area, and it also gives you an opportunity to kind of stretch. Like if you want to test out a menu item, or a few menu items or a new concept, you can make it virtual and do delivery only for a few months and just see what consumers' reaction is. The other good thing is if you're working with a third-party delivery partner, they can give you really good research. Actually, there's research out there for free right now on what delivers well during certain times. So certain times a year, certain types of food are more desirable. As you can imagine, I think everyone right now is advertising their hot dog because it's the summer. So you have that kind of data there. You can create a virtual only, a delivery only restaurant using that consumer data, and you know it's going to perform really well because you have this information behind you. So, I mean, I'm very excited about virtual restaurants. I think it's a real opportunity for restaurants who want to try something new. It could be really, really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah, so this is the latest example. This was just a headline from this week. I don't know if it popped up correctly. ASAP Poke. It's from Let Us Entertain You. Obviously, Lettuce is a very well-known brand. They've got several restaurant concepts out there, and this is their first virtual restaurant. Operating in Chicago right now, I think only within a 3-mile radius, which is probably preferred if you're going to serve tuna like that.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of food safety. All right, so I'll jump in real quick and then turn it over to Anna on some of the drone technology, because we're seeing a lot in this space, but obviously even as you see some of the mobile units, there's been quite a bit of conversation at the National Restaurant Association as well as the Texas Restaurant Association as we work together on some of these topics on just what is the role of drones and some of the mobile units in restaurants. How are they being utilized? Are we on the cusp of sort of where this is going, and then what is, like virtual, where is it going? Certainly we see all kinds of manifestations about how delivery is handling, retail's handling it, and what retail is doing, and how drone delivery and even some of the mobile units are playing into retail. But as you get to the restaurant conversation, it becomes a slightly different conversation in terms of not a lot of restaurants are using drones yet, but it's starting to gain a lot of I would say, momentum, and the conversation is certainly there. Before I turn it over to Anna for some of the trends and research, let me just say this is a space that the government is definitely in. So while the government's not touching on-demand delivery yet, and certainly not touching what's going on with virtual restaurants, drones landing on the White House lawn has gotten everybody's attention. So for better or for worse, the government does not think of drone delivery as a good thing right now, right? There's been several high-profile incidents in Washington, but as you look at sort of what drones, where can they fly, how do you regulate personal use versus commercial use, a lot of that conversation is still happening. And again, it was driven by some high-profile media events. Not saying everybody's using it that way, but certainly as you talk about drones, there's starting to be a lot of conversation as to what to do about this, how to get engaged and involved, what's commercial, what's personal, and what should be the expectation around drone usage if it is personal versus commercial. So I'll jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple years ago, maybe more than that, when we first started talking about drone delivery, I thought, this is years off. Like, there's no way. I mean, frankly, the government's not going to get their stuff together fast enough to start putting regulation in place so that people can do it safely. But it's actually been going a lot faster than I expected, and that goes along with the technology and how fast the technology has developed. Because a few years ago, 10 years ago, when we had drones, they were no good. They were not stable. They were just really dangerous, frankly. And as they've gotten bigger and more stable, you can actually start to think about them delivering food that doesn't get jostled around as much as it has with other forms. So the one on the left right there is a company called Flirty, Flirtey. They've started doing some experiments in delivering some 7-Eleven products. So they have a partnership with 7-Eleven where they're delivering some basic products. But what does 7-Eleven also serve? Food.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more food delivered via that way once the government's okay with it. And then up at the top, we have something called Starship. And those are their little drone, like autonomous drone vehicles. What happens, and you're going to see this first with, probably Amazon. And probably UPS and some of the other delivery companies, where they go into a neighborhood, they drive a larger truck into a neighborhood, the door opens up, and these little Starship little vehicles, they just go out onto the street and they make their deliveries and then they return. Much like, what's the thing that cleans your carpets?
Oh, yeah.
What's it called? Roomba. Yeah, you know how it just sort of comes and returns. Same sort of deal. And then E24 down in the bottom there is working with a company called Marble with same thing, autonomous vehicles. Obviously, a lot of this experimentation is happening in the Bay Area because it's just people are more willing to try it out. But as we promote more technology and restaurant technology here in Texas, I definitely anticipate to start seeing a lot more of this coming really soon. This makes me very excited. I mean, Jack knows we were talking earlier about it, but I get very excited talking about autonomy in restaurants. I think there's a real opportunity there for us to do better business and make it faster and more safe. And this is only going to continue. Next year we'll be talking about something completely different.
Yeah, I'm sure. And quite frankly, that's where we want to end. This conversation is the beginning of a conversation. There's so much you could say about each of these topics. There's so much detail. So many trends, so much research that we're watching. We have a lot of these companies approaching us at both the Texas Restaurant Association as well as the National Restaurant Association, wanting to work with us, wanting to work with the national introductions to all of you, and certainly they seek our feedback in terms of what are restaurants looking for. So a lot of conversations starting on the front end, but to Anna's point, we are just on the cusp. Next year, this conversation will be fundamentally different, and next year, I suppose you guys who are already doing this will have some lessons learned as you expand Julius into other states, and you know what other states look like. You're going to have even more, base of knowledge than what you have now as you take over the Southeast. And then likewise, as folks are thinking of virtual, as you're thinking of doing your own, there's a lot of conversation about, are those employees your employees, are they contractors? So there's still a lot more in this space, and we're just giving you the feel and flavor from a 30,000 foot level, knowing that as this continues to evolve, it's just something to put on your radar screen, because everyone says, well, delivery's old. We're past that point, and we're not. We're still on the cusp of that conversation starting, and where it goes over the next 2 or 3 years, obviously is, the part of the conversation we want to try to get our arms around now to provide best practice for going forward.
Yeah, I mean, like Cicely said, this isn't ending, certainly. We've seen some really interesting research coming out of Technomic, which is a Winsight company. Mm-hmm. They actually released a report that said, like, how much are consumers willing to pay, and how long are they willing to wait for delivery? The ideal time for delivery for consumers is considered 30 minutes. That's kind of where they like it to be. Yeah. But they're willing to pay a lot of money to get that really good restaurant product delivered to them. And I think it is important that we rely on consumers to shoulder a lot of the burden of those fees, honestly, in the future. One of the things that the TRA is going to be doing, we actually have this coming up on August 18th, I think. We are holding a delivery summit in Austin. So we're looking for restaurant operators and delivery companies to come and be a part of that. And we're going to have open dialogue together, open, polite dialogue together about what we can be doing better and how these delivery companies might be working better with restaurant operators. They are willing to listen, I will say that. Any conversation I've had with any of these delivery companies, they're totally willing to take criticism and try and come up with solutions, which I think is a very positive sign.
Yeah, so this is not meant to be somebody's good and somebody's bad. This is meant to be, how does the relationship work for both sides? So let me open it up. We'll take questions. I think we've got a few minutes here for questions. Julius, since we met you earlier and unfortunately we know your name, anything to add? You are in 5 states. You're expanding your regional delivery company, but you certainly talked about some of the contracts and the way you're working with restaurants. Anything to add here? And we'll ask these folks over here the same question. Exactly. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Julius. I appreciate that. And I do want to point out, too, that the companies that identified themselves earlier, we do consider them good players. Yeah. I mean, these guys, practice. They work with restaurants. They aren't the ones out there scraping menus, scraping logos or anything like that. It's actually like kudos to them for being such large companies who obviously want to grow very quickly, for taking the time and making sure that the restaurant knows what's happening. So, I mean, Uber, Amazon, hats off to you guys. You're doing it right.
Anything from the folks over here on this side? Some of you said you were doing your own delivery, and obviously folks from Amazon are here. Anything from y'all? Okay.
We've never created a situation where a customer gets disappointed in that transaction without taking accountability for that. We have live people on staff. We get a live person through any customer. From a restaurant perspective or from a customer perspective, they're available from 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. well outside of our normal delivery hours.
Yeah.
Make sure we protect that customer.
That's good. We may want to add that as a best practice, Anna, in terms of some of the having a hotline, having something go well beyond delivery hours for those kinds of calls. That may be when we may want to add to the list in terms of customer or consumer contact or contact for the restaurants. That's actually that's a great point. Yeah. No, that's a good point. What were the hours again? Till 1 a.m. Here in Dallas. Okay. All right. That's interesting. That's good to know. Yeah. How about you folks here? Oh, yes, sir. Got 2 questions here. Yes, sir. Let me give you my mic just to make sure that we can, you got that one? Okay.
A restaurateur should be very much concerned how fast the food gets from the kitchen to the table. How are we handling this problem if we have to deliver 20 minutes to 30 minutes out? This is huge. And the other part is the liability part that you mentioned earlier. Once the food leaves the premises, is your insurance covering it?
Yeah. The gentleman right beside had a question as well.
Well, I just wanted to acknowledge that real
Sure.
quick. I mean, because if you think about it, these companies that are delivering food are in the logistics business. In fact, the ones that are doing it right are in the logistics business. They're not in the food business. So hopefully they know how to get things from point A to point B very quickly and hot. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask a question about using multiple delivery companies out of one restaurant. I use a local delivery service, third-party delivery service, but I've been approached by others, and some of them in their contract they want to be the only company that you use. And I was just curious, having other people, delivery people here, what their feelings are, and if y'all have come across anything. And then also wanted to ask about customer feedback. When there's a mistake made, who does the customer blame? Like, we get people calling us instead of the delivery company.
Exactly.
And so I want to know whose reputation's getting hurt a little bit by either us making a mistake or the delivery company making a mistake.
It's a good question. It's a very good question.
It's you.
It's you.
Yeah, it's you.
Every single time.
It does, yeah. I mean, yes, they will absolutely blame the restaurant. He's with Waiter.
Waiter, yeah.
Yeah, they will absolutely blame you. I asked one of the delivery companies one day when they first got started, I said, so what happens if a customer writes a negative review on Yelp and it's about a piece of food that was delivered by you guys? They were like, oh, well, we have a team of 20 dedicated to reading Yelp reviews. It was the biggest line of bullshit I've ever heard. I mean, it was just like, that is not true. Like, you're not doing that. And they haven't been. So, I mean, it's really tricky. Luckily, if you have a contract in place, that's covered. So if you have a contract with one of these delivery companies, that should be part of it. That, like, if there's something negative posted about it, they should be the ones responsible to follow up. Yeah, also, a lot of these third-party companies have rating systems within the app, and so it's better to start with that than for them to go somewhere public. Obviously, you can't control that, but if the option's there, that's a good sign. And then about working with multiple delivery companies, I would recommend staying with multiples. I wouldn't sign an exclusivity unless you really, really like the business that they're giving you, and make sure that they build in a lot of marketing around that for you, because that's really what it is if a delivery company can say, if Postmates says we're the only one in town delivering Mad Taco, I mean, that's a huge boon for them. So of course they're going to want to say that. So I would stick to multiples. Now the tricky thing is, of course, is when you start to get more delivery orders, can you handle that? And then certain ones have different fees attached to it.
Yeah.
Really?
So the comment was he has not run into folks who are charging fees. They just go to the website. It's based on the website, correct? It's their website. Your menu. Right. That's a new one. I have not heard that yet. Usually the cost structure and the fee structure becomes a very big part of the multiple versus exclusivity conversation. And can you leverage one about the other? But that's interesting.
Yeah, the highest I've seen is a 30% fee.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. You've seen higher? Yeah.
You've seen
terrible.
higher? Okay.
That's terrible. One thing I did want to bring up as well. Oh, is there a question?
This gentleman has
yeah.
a question.
Sir.
there anyone right now in this market that's combining them and integrating them either with POS or with each other, so that way, so like I deal with, I don't know, 9 different delivery companies.
Okay.
It's 9 different iPads, 9 different
I know.
structures. So if there was, it's $1 billion idea.
The one who's doing it right now is Olo, out of New York. Great people. I mean, really smart, obviously, because they figured that out. There are, I mean, Delivery.com technically is an aggregator as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Good analogy.
Trivago. Yeah.
Go ahead and talk about dashboarding. You said dashboarding got sued.
DoorDash.
DoorDash, I'm sorry. Have they stopped doing that?
No.
They haven't.
No. No. I mean, I do. Well,
Unless you have a trademark or something, they have free reign.
you know, that's the thing is we don't have a case to point to say you cannot do this. It is illegal. So until that is set, like, you know, we can't do that. One thing that's Yeah, I'll talk about them. One thing that I found really interesting that is coming up in a lot of restaurants as well, I'd be curious to hear from you guys, is how to handle tipping. Because the people that are
The other cost structure.
the people that are putting together the food normally get a tip whenever, you know, someone comes in and picks up the delivery food. Well, these companies, like I talk with Favor a lot because they're close here. They're here. Well, I'm based in Austin and they're based in Austin, and they're running into this issue where they don't actually know how to solve this problem either. Is it just mandatory? Do the Favor runners leave a tip for the person who's putting together the delivery order? Some of them do, some of them don't. Some people have started to request that. So if you make an order through Favor, you can request of your Favor runner, hey, leave a 20% tip and just bill me. And because that's how it works, is they don't bill until afterward when they get the full package. But it's a huge question, and we're not quite sure how to fix that. Do we build that into a service fee? You know, anytime someone's ordering from delivery, you charge a 20% service fee to that company, meaning to that consumer. It's a big question mark in my mind. Yes, ma'am.
So you're in Austin, I'm in Bernie, the Bernie Fredericksburg area.
Yeah.
What's happening in small towns? I hadn't even heard of some of this until I went to the National Restaurant Show. It was in restaurants that have multiple iPads and all of that. What's happening in small towns? What do you guys see as the future of small towns and these types of things?
There's actually an interesting company that I don't know if they've launched successfully yet called Good Uncle. They're based out of New York, but they were going to secondary markets. So they're not in rural markets, but they're going to secondary markets. So like small college towns, like I went to Texas State, go Bobcats. But what they're doing is they're actually creating these restaurant concepts that have multiple types of menu items from famous restaurants. So like they wanted to get the recipe for the Shake Shack burger and offer Shake Shack burgers in a secondary market. Or they wanted to get, I can't think of anything right now, but like they wanted to get a Zaxby's salad and put that in a secondary market and be able to deliver that. That's the only thing really innovative that I'm seeing. And I think there's been a lot of snags with that along the way. It's just going to take a lot longer time until we get those delivery companies out there. I know I hate it. I live in Wimberley now, and I can't get delivery at all.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've gotten similar feedback to what you've gotten, is people see it and they're like, we had no idea. What is this? What are you seeing? I mean, Jack was giving me a hard time about my little small town in Tennessee, and I was telling Julius he needs to come to Tennessee to deliver more, because when my parents come to Washington, they're like, wait, people bring food to you from a restaurant? Like, who's DoorDash? Who's Caviar? Like, what's, and so it's just, I think it may become an urban suburban. I don't know that it gets to rural, to Anna's point, anytime soon. Now, but to your point, if somebody cracks the code there, it's going to be, phenomenal, but I just don't know that we're quite there yet. So you may see urban go suburban, but then how quickly it continues to evolve, I think, is actually the question.
Yeah, the fastest way to make money in the secondary or suburban areas is actually to do that commissary type kitchen where you have multiple types of food being delivered out of one central location.
Yeah.
I mean, if anyone wants to start that business model, I think it's up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone over here? Questions, comments?
Great. Well, if you guys are in Texas and want to join us for that summit that I mentioned, please come talk to me about it. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Anything else? The gift of time is always a good one. So if we give you a few minutes back, hopefully that's a good thing. Anything else before we close out? I appreciate all the questions, obviously. Thank you all for being here who are
Thank you,
in the
guys.
delivery business. Thank you for partnering with restaurants. We appreciate it. Thank you, Julius. All right, nice to meet everybody. Have a good afternoon.